Well, good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Helen Sullivan. I'm the Director of the Melbourne School of Government, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2014 Hamer Oration, delivered this year by the Honourable John Brumby. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Wurundjeri people. The Hamer Oration on Good Government is an important event in the University of Melbourne calendar. The oration acknowledges the particular contribution of David Hamer, representative for Isaacs for 8 years and a Victorian senator for another 12. David was a great champion of the committee system in the Senate and an advocate of reform to the Westminster system, as outlined in his book, Can Responsible Government Survive in Australia? A question which many of us have pondered subsequent to its publication. We are fortunate to have a number of members of the Hamer family with us this evening, including Barbara Hamer, David's wife, and a notable member of the University of Melbourne University Council from 1990 to 1997. Welcome to you all. It's thanks to the generous sponsorship of the Hamer family that the university is able to invite a leading public figure to reflect on an aspect of contemporary governance with a view to promoting discussion and debate. Past orations have covered challenges such as the future role of philanthropy in public policy, Indigenous governance, climate change, the rise of China, and the role of the Australian Senate. John Brumby's theme for this year's oration is a federation for the future, and it could hardly be more topical given the contents of last week's federal budget. Those of you who are regular attenders to the event will know that we did not hold an oration last year, not because we didn't have a topic, we did. We knew we wanted something on federalism, but we weren't sure of the timing, and we couldn't find the right speaker. Eventually, we did decide on the timing, and we found absolutely the right speaker. Perspicacity or serendipity, I leave it to you to decide. But it turns out that our timing couldn't have been more appropriate. The university has hosted the Hamer Oration since 2007, initially through the Centre for Public Policy. But in 2014, the oration has a new home at the university in the Melbourne School of Government. The school, which is itself coming up to its first birthday, reflects the university's own commitment as a public-spirited institution to the promotion of sound and responsible government. It is a cross-faculty institution that brings together disciplinary expertise from across the university with the knowledge and skills of policymakers, industry leaders, community activists, and social entrepreneurs in the service of the major governance and public policy challenges of our time. This important investment in the Melbourne School of Government supports rigorous research geared towards actionable solutions at all levels from the global to the local, with a specific focus on our place in the region. It promotes innovative graduate and post-experience teaching to equip those working in and with government with the relevant knowledge and skills. And it fosters informed public debate through its active events and seminar programs. In our first year, we have run an important international conference focusing on the challenges for public policy of the Asian century. We've launched a new Masters of Public Administration, a cross-faculty programme that brings together the study of economics, law and politics, along with philosophy and public management, and also initiated a wide range of research activities, many of which are undertaken in partnership with external collaborators from all sectors and many different parts of the world. An important first investment for us was our Federalism Research Cluster, led by Professor Miranda Stewart from the Law School, now, of course, leading the Tax Research Centre at ANU, and involving leading academics from Australia, as well as an important partnership with the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria. This 2-year project will combine research into a range of areas crucial to a renewal of federalism, including taxation, which, as Miranda has pointed out, was one of the dogs that didn't bark in the budget. But it also combines that research activity with a number of public interventions. And this Hamer Oration, with its focus on a federation for the future, marks one of those interventions. After more than 100 years since federation, the government's upcoming white paper on reform, and more recently, of course, the budget, presents a historic opportunity to reconsider federal-state relations and responsibilities, particularly in the light of what's happened last week, but also, as others have already reminded us, in the light of history. How can state and federal governments work effectively to deal with the increasing demographic, social and global economic challenges facing Australia? There are probably few people better placed than the Honourable John Brumby to reflect on how we might shape the future of Australian federalism. John Brumby was the former Premier of Victoria from 2007 to 2010 and has immense experience in public life, serving for more than 10 years as Treasurer and then Premier of Victoria, 6 years as Leader of the Victorian Opposition and 7 years as a federal representative for Bendigo during the period of the Hawke government. Since retiring from politics, Mr Brumby has accepted a number of board positions, as well as a joint appointment to both the Melbourne and Monash universities as a Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Fellow. As those of you who've had an opportunity to review John's CV on our website, you'll discover that, unlike most normal people, John seems to pack an incredible amount into any 24-hour period. We don't have time to list the number of boards, appointments, and responsibilities that he has, but here are just a few. He's chairman of the Motor Trades Association of Australia, the Superannuation Fund, an independent director of Huawei Technologies Australia, a director of Citywide Solutions Limited, and chairman, until the 30th of June, of the COAG Reform Council. During 2011-12, Mr Brumby was also a panel member of the federal government's review into GST distribution. Importantly for us, though, John is very closely linked to the School of Government, both through his positions in the Faculty of Business and Economics, which is, like the law school in which we meet, one of our core faculties. He's also been an incredibly strong supporter of the school, offering advice when asked, and contributing with great knowledge, enthusiasm, and commitment to our early activities, including spending many hours with our students. And it's one of the things that you don't often get to hear about, but John is incredibly generous with his time with our graduate students and will discuss almost any aspect of politics that they wish him to. And indeed, this afternoon, he has spent most of the afternoon, it seems, conducting media interviews in preparation for this lecture, so that he is well warmed up, if nothing else. The format for this evening is that John will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. For those of you who are Twitter literate or who are interested in becoming Twitter literate, we do have a Twitter feed, and the hashtag is here, Australian Oz Federalism, so please do make use of that. But first, please join me in welcoming the Honourable John Brumby to deliver this year's Hamer Oration.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Helen Sullivan, for a very generous introduction this evening to Barbara Hamer and to members of the Hamer family, to distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. And can I begin my speech tonight too by acknowledging traditional owners and paying my respects to elders past and present. And can I say right at the outset how delighted I am to see so many people here this evening. I actually came up the stairs through a back entrance to the building at about 6:22 this evening, and there was just three of us, I think, here, and I thought it would be a very big hall with a very empty sort of audience, and so I'm really pleased that we have such a great turnout tonight. And for those of you who are regular attenders at the Hamer Oration, I hope that I won't disappoint you. And I think, to reiterate a point that Helen made earlier, I think when I was invited to make this oration, it was actually last year. And we looked at a series of dates, and who was to know that the issue of federalism and federal-state relations would be as topical as it is today. So I hope that these remarks add some value to that debate. It is an honour, of course, to follow in the footsteps of other distinguished speakers to deliver the Hamer Oration this evening. And as I said, can I acknowledge the members of the Hamer family and their commitment to keeping alive the legacy of David Hamer, and indeed that of his brothers Dick and Alan and his sister Alison. In many ways, I think it's true to say that the four Hamer siblings were a product of their time, yet also very much ahead of their time. They each, in their own way, led lives of exemplary public service, no doubt influenced by the sacrifices of a post-war climate and the traditions of their youth. Their commitment to service in areas as diverse as the military, education, science, politics and business featured heavily in each Hamer sibling's history and story. David served his country through a long and distinguished career as an officer in the Royal Australian Navy and later in both the Federal House of Representatives and the Senate. Dick Hamer also served in the armed forces on 3 tours of duty in World War II, including as a RAT of Tobruk and at El Alamein. But he's perhaps best remembered as Premier of Victoria from 1972 to 1981, elected under the slogan, "Hamer makes it happen." Alison was a renowned historian of the French Revolution and university lecturer. And finally, the youngest brother, Alan, a Rhodes Scholar and chemist. He also played a role in the war effort by putting his knowledge of chemistry to good use. Alan worked on the neutralisation of carbon monoxide to prevent bomber crews from death by poisoning, and after war he went on to an illustrious career in business. And so it's fair to say that they were a family of high achievers. The Hamers may have been shaped by the challenging times in which they lived, but they were also great innovators and reformers. David and Dick Hamer's commitment to social justice and pursuit of progressive policies is particularly worth dwelling on for a moment. It won both of them the title of Small L Liberal. And in this they followed in the tradition of a number of other well-known politicians from Victoria, Deakin, Menzies, Holt and Gorton. Barry Jones once described Dick Hamer as the finest flower of the Victorian Deaconite tradition. As Premier, Dick Hamer exemplified the positive role that government can play in shaping Australian society for the better. His achievements were significant and enduring. He greatly strengthened environmental protection laws and, in fact, as we know, introduced the green wedges to Melbourne. He abolished the death penalty in Victoria. He ensured Aboriginal communities were given ownership of their lands. He decriminalised homosexuality and introduced anti-discrimination laws. And as we all know, he was a wonderful supporter of the arts. And his slogan, the Garden State, neatly captured Dick Hamer's personal love of gardening as well as Victoria's wonderful quality of life. And David likewise was passionately committed to enhancing good governance in Australia. He wrote extensively and argued passionately on improving the Westminster system in Australia, particularly in regards to the Senate. David supported the improvement of the Senate as a house of review, and he believed that our Senate committee system could and should be as rigorous and as searching in their oversight of proposed laws as their powerful US counterpart committees. In honour of these 4 great Australians, this evening I would like to talk about the nation, or rather the particular political structure and system of government that has guided us as a nation since 1901. And so I'm talking about federalism and the Australian Federation. The issue of federalism is, of course, particularly topical at the moment. I expect that the government will very shortly release its terms of reference for the white paper on reform of the Federation. Discussion of our Federation also featured heavily in the recent Commission of Audit report, which stated that, and I quote, "The current operation of the Federation poses a fundamental challenge to the delivery of good, responsible government in Australia." As might be expected, this sparked a flurry of commentary in the media on how the Australian Federation is broken and dysfunctional. Commentators referred to it as wasteful, multifaceted, and an ineffective shambles. As someone who has spent more than 25 years in public life, in the federal parliament, state parliament, as opposition leader, treasurer, premier, and more recently as chair of the COAG Reform Council, I don't accept this analysis at all. What my experience has shown me, despite the colour, the movement, and, might I say, the occasional shrillness of media and political commentary, is that Australia's federation has actually served us rather well. Despite our small population, we are now the world's 12th largest economy, with our median wealth amongst the very highest in the world. And unlike many countries, we enjoy a stable democracy and a vibrant multicultural society. When much of the rest of the world struggled through the global financial crisis, Australia maintained an economy with low inflation, low interest rates, low unemployment, and solid growth. And of course, our achievements are not just economic. In the latest report from the OECD Better Life Initiative, Australia is rated as above average in 10 of the 11 life dimensions examined. Australia is rated at the top when it comes to governance and civic engagement, and close to the top when it comes to environmental quality and health status. We rate in the top 20% when it comes to housing, personal security, jobs and earnings. These fantastic results didn't all just happen by chance or by accident. Among other things, it's a result of our system of government, a federation that is uniquely well suited to responding quickly and creatively to global events and trends, while also meeting the diverse needs and the diverse and changing needs of our local communities. I don't say for a moment that our federation is perfect, but I do say that it has served us well, and it serves us well today. Certainly much has changed since 6 independent colonies became one nation in 1901. The South Australian politician Richard Baker, in an 1897 pamphlet advocating the federalist cause, listed one of the probable benefits of federalism as creating, and I quote, greater economy and efficiency in the management of the postal and telegraph departments, no doubt ultimately resulting in a penny postage and a 6-penny telegram. And now today, more than 14 million Australians have internet access in their homes. There are more than 31 million personal mobile services in use for a population of just more than 20 million people. And the point of this story is that the world is more connected than ever before. We're subject to more competition than ever before, and change occurs more quickly than ever before. And so many of you may ask if a system of government drawn up at the end of the 19th century and activated at the dawn of the 20th century can still have currency in the 21st century. And absolutely it does, because federalism works. In 2007, the States commissioned Professors Anne Toomey and Glenn Withers to prepare a report for the Council of the Australian Federation on what federalism has to offer today. In their report, they identified 6 major benefits. First, federalism provides a check on power. It divides power and it limits the amount of it that any one government can enjoy. Second, it offers choice and diversity. People can vote for one party if they wish at a federal level and another at a state level. Third, federalism offers customisation of policies. The various Australian states and territories, they're all different in their climate, their topography, their demography, their culture, their resources and their industries. A policy that works well in Tasmania may not work so well in Alice Springs. Fourth, it allows for creativity and innovation. As US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandel famously put it, quote, a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. States are forced to innovate to meet their distinctive challenges and to compete with other states. Successful innovations can then be picked up by either other states or the Commonwealth, while the damage caused by any failed policies is limited. There are numerous examples of this innovation strength in our federation. As I outlined in my introduction, many new approaches to social and environmental policy were trialled by Dick Hamer's government and are now the law of the land nationally. Public sector reform was introduced by the Kane government and adopted Australia-wide. Case mix funding for public hospitals was introduced by the Kennett government and is now applied Australia-wide. South Australia pioneered anti-discrimination legislation. Western Australia set up the first healthcare call centres. All of these innovations, they are much harder to strike with a centrally managed unitary system of government. A fifth benefit is the potential for healthy competition between the states. In the economy, healthy competition means that the consumer benefits from lower cost, more effective and more innovative products. And it's the same in a federation, where constituents can, if they wish, vote with their feet and move to a jurisdiction with better infrastructure, better schools and better regulatory environments. And of course, the final benefit of federalism is cooperation. Our federal model means that many of the most important national reforms require the agreement of one or more of the states and territories, and often every single one of them. The mechanism for this in Australia is the Council of Australian Governments process. Admittedly, what happens around the COAG table isn't always pretty, but many of the decisions that are taken there have transformed Australia. And the truth is that most of the big decisions that have transformed Australia couldn't have happened without Commonwealth state cooperation and agreement. And some examples. The gun buyback scheme introduced by Prime Minister Howard after the Port Arthur massacre couldn't have happened without the agreement and the administrative capacity of the states. The National Competition Policy, which has contributed to 23 years of economic growth. The GST, which was both a major taxation and economic reform. The 2008 National Reform Agenda. And of course, more recently, the agreement to introduce a national disability scheme. All of these transformative policies couldn't have happened without Commonwealth state cooperation and agreement. And so these 6 benefits of federation combine to form a type of governance system that is flexible and responsive to both the needs of individual citizens but also the needs of the nation as a whole. And in my view, that's why it works. But this is not to say that there isn't room for improvement in our federation. Some argue for more cooperation and collaboration, others for a much more competitive model. The recent Commission of Audit advocated for a focus on, quote, competitive federalism. As I've outlined, a level of healthy competition between states is certainly one of the many benefits of our federation. However, when it comes to competitive federalism, we should be careful that we don't end up with destructive competition between states displayed as chest-beating and parochialism combined with a disdain for collaboration in the national interest. We should also be careful that we don't get into a situation where we're competing with each other in a race to the bottom of lower taxes and also lower services. And we should be careful that we don't end up with a fragmented patchwork of different rules and regulations that stifle domestic and international trade, where it might once again be easier, for example, to sell gas across the borders of Europe than it is to sell gas across the state borders of Australia. Ken Henry, speaking at a Productivity Commission 2005 Productive Reform in Our Federal System Roundtable, questioned whether the excess of inconsistent state-based regulatory requirements in areas such as occupational licensing, occupational health and safety, road transport and water trading could be attributed to federalism. It was a fair question. One of the examples he provided was an operator of an interstate train having to deal with 6 access regulators, 7 rail safety regulators, with 9 different pieces of legislation, 3 transport accident investigators, 15 pieces of legislation covering occupational health and safety of rail operations, and 75 pieces of legislation with powers over environmental management. He also noted that Australia had 7 rail safety regulators for a population of around 20 million people, whereas the United States, with a population of 285 million, had just 1. The example, I think, demonstrates the inefficiencies and the duplication that can arise between governments without appropriate cooperation and central coordination. Thankfully, you'll be pleased to know that a great many of those problems were fixed as part of the COAG seamless national economy reforms introduced in 2008. However, others have remained, and there is certainly a danger that the gains that were made will be undone with the passing of time. The truth is that we need a sophisticated combination of both cooperation and competition, because we need to remember that we're not just competing between states, we're also competing with the world, and our region now has some of the best competitors around. In China, we're neighbours to a country that has taken over even the US now in terms of manufactured output, energy use and car sales. And according to the IMF, China will overtake America as the world's largest economy at purchasing power parity by just 2017. According to the OECD's latest assessments, 4 of the 5 highest performing school systems in the world are now Hong Kong, Korea, Shanghai and Singapore. The Grattan Institute recently pointed to the fact that the average 15-year-old in Shanghai is now 2 to 3 years ahead of his or her counterpart in Australia. In contrast to these impressive gains, Australian educational performance has been more mixed over the past 10 years. So it's vital that we think, discuss and debate how best to harness the key strengths of our federation in order to compete in a world and a region that is in profound and lasting transition. And it's also vital that we think, discuss and debate how best to improve our current federation. And I'm thinking more specifically about how to solve the vexed issue in our federation of roles and responsibilities. As a fellow ex-Premier, Nick Greiner said in an opinion piece earlier this month, and I quote, "The question of who does what to whom and why in Australian governments is not theoretical or artificial, it is fundamental to the quality of life of Australian citizens." And I couldn't agree more. Our federal system was based on the idea that the greater body of power would remain with the state governments. Indeed, it was intended by most of the framers that in the new nation, the states would in fact be the dominant partner. This is reflected in how power is divided by the Constitution. There were certain defined powers for the federal government that made logical sense for a national government to provide, and all other powers outside of the list essentially remained with the states. The topics granted to the Commonwealth by the Constitution range from areas like marriage to defence and the regulation of corporations. The states retained control over major areas like health and education. And yet in 2014, we have, of course, vast federal departments of both health and education. And the reasons for this are complex, but they mainly relate to the bane of many federations, which is vertical fiscal imbalance. Vertical fiscal imbalance, VFI, refers to the mismatch between what the various levels of government in Australia are required to do and the amount of revenue that they're able to raise in order to do it. The Commonwealth took over the state's main source of revenue, income tax, around the time of the Second World War. However, the states retained responsibility for two of the largest costs in our country, health and education, and nowhere near the ability to pay for it from their own revenue base. To offset this, the Commonwealth Government pays the states grants to cover these responsibilities. For every dollar the Victorian Government, for example, spends on police, public transport, education or health, around 50 cents in total comes directly from the federal government. But of course, this can leave the public unsure of who is really accountable for their services. It can encourage blame shifting, it can encourage buck passing between state and federal governments. The federal government also has a natural tendency to micromanage exactly how the money it gives the states is spent. And really, in a sense, this kills the ability of state governments to innovate in their delivery of services or make services more appropriate to meet specific local needs. And finally, of course, the federal government is often tempted to just take over areas of state responsibility, often for whatever reason they wish, so that they can affect a particular policy outcome. And they're able to do this due to the broad rulings by the High Court of the Commonwealth's power under the Constitution, as well as the Commonwealth's ability to raise so much more revenue. And so what we have is the often heavy-handed influence by the Commonwealth over great swathes of policy areas that they were never intended to have. And what all of this means is that our federation has become increasingly out of balance. To remedy those faults and to get it back into balance, we need to better align the roles and the responsibilities with the revenue. Clearly, the roles and responsibilities in our federation have changed from what was intended by the framers of our Constitution. But does that mean we should go back to how everything was in 1901? Well, of course, I don't necessarily think so, and I don't think that's necessarily the solution. I think we should assess the nature of the issue and then determine the level of government best suited to dealing with it in 2014 and the years ahead. We need to work to clarify the roles and responsibility of the states and the federal government. And when deciding who should do what, the principle of subsidiarity should be central. That is, the specific roles and responsibilities should go to the level of government closest to the people affected who is capable of effectively delivering them. It makes sense for the states to have responsibility for things like health and education, just like it makes sense for the Commonwealth to be in charge of defence and foreign affairs. And we then need to compare these agreed responsibilities with the current revenue-raising capacity of each state and, moreover, the states more generally. If they don't have the revenue-raising capacity, then we need to examine ways in which they can fund their service responsibilities. In essence, this can be done in one of four ways. Give the states a share of income tax. Secondly, increase the GST and give the proceeds to the states. Thirdly, increase transfers from the Commonwealth to the states. And fourthly, leave the states to increase their own taxes. The recent Commission of Audit advocated providing states with an ability to raise their own income tax. This would allow the federal government to lower the amount that they collect by the same proportion. A number of current state premiers were very interested in this idea, and it has a certain elegance. However, the Prime Minister said at the post-COAG meeting press conference on Friday, May the 2nd, that he was against the idea of what he called double taxation. Of course, what he didn't mention at the time was that the Commonwealth was about to withdraw a massive $80 billion in Commonwealth funding to the states for education and health over the next decade. And the Prime Minister went on to say that as the states have responsibility for education and health under the Constitution, then they should be, as far as possible, sovereign in their own sphere. I agree with his view about the role of the states, but it follows that if the states have these responsibilities, they also require the revenue to properly discharge them. As I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of World War II, the states were reasonably financially self-sufficient due to their sharing with the Commonwealth of the income tax base. However, since then, there's been an increasing monopolisation, if I could put it that way, of the most lucrative taxes by the Commonwealth, particularly with the Commonwealth's takeover of income taxation in 1942 and the High Court's rulings on taxation of goods and services and excise. At the same time as the states' own sources of revenues have decreased, the costs of their liabilities, that is, the essential services that they need to provide to the population, have increased, and they'll continue to do so. A key driver of increasing costs is our rapidly ageing population. As the Leader of the Opposition pointed out in his budget response last week, when he was at school, there were 7.5 taxpayers to support each Australian aged 65 or over. By 2050, it will only be 2.7 to 1. Population growth and ageing will affect labour supply, economic output, infrastructure requirements and government budgets. Collectively, it's projected that Australian governments will face additional pressures on their budgets equivalent to around 6% of national GDP by 2060, principally reflecting the growth of expenditure on health, aged care and the age pension. And the current GST is certainly not going to fill the hole in state finances. Many commentators, just looking at articles over the last few weeks, seem to have forgotten that in the IGA agreed in 1999, the states were required to abolish up to 10 existing state taxes in order to get access to the GST revenues. And I think this was the right move at the time. Many of these taxes were inefficient and impacted specific areas of the economy, such as stamp duty on mortgages, duty on quoted marketable securities, duty on leases, financial institutions, bank accounts, debits tax, and so on. Getting rid of these taxes was a good idea, and the result was a better tax system and a more efficient economy. However, revenues have fallen well short of the rivers of gold that were promised. GST collections are barely above the minimum level that the Commonwealth agreed to underwrite back in the 1999 IGA. In fact, from a purely selfish point of view, some of the states today would probably be in a better fiscal position if they just retained the state taxes that they gave up to get the GST. And much of the reason for this is that there are large and growing structural weaknesses in the GST revenue base. Fresh food, health and education expenses are exempt, and banking services are comparatively lightly taxed. GST revenue has been growing much more slowly than the economy as a whole because the untaxed components make up a larger share of consumption. The truth of the matter is that even before the budget announcement of the withdrawal of the $80 billion of Commonwealth funding, the issue of how to fund education and health care and how to get the Federation back into better balance was a conversation that we were always going to have. And it's not just about Commonwealth state responsibilities and who does what. The reality is that post-GFC, Australian government, state and federal, have a major revenue problem. Our existing taxes and charges are simply not adequate to provide the responsible and reasonable services in health and education that the community expects us to provide. As a young backbencher who in 1985 publicly supported Paul Keating's option C, that famously, of course, included a consumption tax, I've been around long enough to know how difficult it is to get a consensus on tax issues. But when we look at the possible other outcomes of either crushing deficits or failing to care for our most vulnerable people, GST reform, to me, looks more and more like the best option that we've got. In my view, the real debate about the GST is not about whether it needs to increase. I actually think there's a certain inevitability about that. The real debate is about the nature of the increase. Is it base? Is it rate? Is it both? The compensation that's provided to low-income earners and pensioners, and the distribution of the proceeds, which will come down really to a debate about the states versus the rest. And by the way, while I'm on this subject, the federal government should immediately move to reduce the erosion of GST collections from overseas internet purchases. Not only does the current situation place Australian suppliers at a competitive disadvantage, it's costing the states hundreds of millions of dollars a year in lost revenue, which could be going into hospital emergency departments. COAG was the vehicle of reform for the original GST conversation in the late 90s, and COAG should be the vehicle for reform again. The original GST could have been introduced with or without the cooperation of the states. And without the involvement of COAG and the agreement of the states, the GST would still have been, in my mind, a useful tax reform, but of no major note. By involving the states and linking the proceeds of the GST to the abolition of up to 10 inefficient state taxes, the introduction of the GST was both a major taxation and economic reform for all Australians. This time around, if we think it through, the circumstances are very different. We have a federation that over time has become increasingly out of balance, exacerbated by the recent federal budget, which shifts a massive $80 billion of spending to the states, and which, in my view, makes their medium and long-term budget position completely untenable and unsustainable. In these circumstances, I believe we have a unique opportunity to rebalance the Federation and to provide an enduring and better match between roles, responsibilities and revenue. Throughout this process, it's vital that the public and opinion leaders are able to participate in this debate. I therefore strongly support a Federation Convention to be held later this year or early 2015. I also believe it's vital to properly monitor the performance of the Federation and the progress of reforms. Shifting federal-state relations to reflect greater subsidiarity and reduce duplication is a significant reform ambition. And as with any major reform, it requires a plan with identified steps and activities with associated milestones, targets and timelines. It also requires a way to hold governments to account for the outcomes sought by the Federation. I therefore support the early establishment of a Federation Reform Council to independently monitor the timetable, the milestones and the progress of any new arrangements. As I said earlier, Australia is doing very well in comparison to the rest of the world, and in my view this is due in part, large part, to our structure of government, to our federation. But we should realise that there are many important junctures coming up for our nation that we need to deal with. And it will be up to the media, to interest groups, to universities, to businesses, political leaders, to ensure that this opportunity to improve our federation is not wasted. Because I don't think we can run away from this discussion. I'd like to leave you tonight with an anecdote from David Hamer's book, Can Responsible Government Survive in Australia? And in it he describes the ancient Goths' approach to deciding matters of importance in the context of our own Senate. And he wrote, and I quote, "The ancient Goths of Germany had all of them a wise custom of debating everything of importance to their state twice. This is, once drunk, that their councils might not want vigour, and once sober, that they might not want discretion." Discretion meaning, of course, the sober consideration of the facts. And I certainly hope the upcoming debate on our federation is vigorous, but will be grounded in sober consideration of the facts. And I think if we get it right, this debate can lead to a federation which is built truly around cooperation, which is focused on driving clear outcomes to advance our national interest, and with a better balance between roles, responsibilities and revenue. Thank you. Okay.
Perfectly timed as well as full of content. So we'll go straight into questions. Who'd like to begin? Okay, gentlemen on the end. Yes, you, sir. We've got microphones, so please wait for them to come. And if you could say your name and keep your question as short as you can, that would be great.
Mr. Brumby, thank you for your lecture. Great on a cool and wet Melbourne night. Two questions. One, I think the federal government's basically thrown a Molotov cocktail at the states, unpredicted. You've come in with a level of reason and history, etc. Is it enough for the premiers at the weekend getting together and saying, we've got a line in the sand? Is this also a case of the federal guys, and you've got a federal history that you might be able to reflect on, saying we're top dog? And secondly, the Australian Charities Commission is in the potential of being repealed versus being kept, and it's in a bit of a balance. That sort of says a sort of a COAG type improvement, nationalised revenue, nationalised legislation, etc., versus state background. What's your views on that? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Two distinct questions. I think the cuts to the, and by the way, I'm obviously speaking tonight as a former Premier and not just as a chair of the COAG Reform Council, so keep that in that context. But I think, the cuts to the states obviously came out of the blue. I mean, there was a COAG meeting on Friday, May the 2nd. States were all there, premiers were there, treasurers were there. Apparently this issue didn't come up. So Treasurer, delivers the budget speech on Tuesday night, and it's shock horror, $80 billion worth of cuts. And if you want an idea of the dimension of those cuts, there's a very good graph actually I think it's in today's Financial Review, produced by the New South Wales government, looking at health funding over the next 20 years. When Paul Keating lost government in 1996, federal funding to the states on health was shared 50-50. By the time Kevin Rudd won government in 2007, federal funding was 40%, state funding was 60%. Kevin Rudd lifted it to just over 42%. What the cuts announced in the budget mean is that by virtually 10 years' time, less than 10 years' time, the proportion of federal funding being provided to the states like New South Wales and Victoria for health funding will drop below 30 cents in the dollar. And indeed, for some states, might drop as low as 25. So we've gone to $1 in $2 to 1 in 4. The impact of that is a genuine, horrific impact. And, if I was a state premier, I'd be angry. about the cuts that have been made. But I'd also be looking for solutions. And I know, politics is a difficult business. I'm in the luxury of not being in it, so today, and it is a luxury. So, today apparently Jeff Kennett's come out and said, well, he supports an increase in the GST, so there you go, Jeff and I are on a unity ticket. And you wouldn't have thought that if you'd seen us across the table 20 years ago in the Parliament. But there you go. We've got the luxury, I guess. Politics is not easy. I know that. I've seen the debates about the GST. But in my mind, looking at what's happening to budgets in Australia, federal and state, looking at the ageing of our population and the demands, I think our revenue is not adequate to meet those demands going forward, even with continued efficiencies and continued productivity improvements, and everybody's going to be looking for more revenue. And so my view, right or wrong, history will judge, is that an increase in the GST, whether in the rate or in the base, is an inevitability. It is a certainty. And that's why I say this is a debate that Australia has to have. If I was a state premier, I think I'd be putting up my hand to say, I'll have the GST. Thank you very much. Courageous decision, difficult decision. But, Wayne Swan used to say to me, because I did the GST review, with Nick Greiner and Bruce Carter, and we talked about some of these things. He used to say every second person who used to come into his office said, put up the GST and we'll take the proceeds. The Business Council used to be in there every week saying, put the GST up, we'll cut company tax by 10 percentage points. Education lobby, welfare lobby, everyone's in there saying, put up the GST, we'll take the proceeds. And I tell you, that, I reckon, is going to be what the debate's about. So if I was a state premier with an opportunity to go out there and to say, yes, a lot of pain, people mightn't like it, but the revenue will flow to the states and it'll go into health and education, I reckon it's the main chance in the locker that they've got. So difficult, I don't pretend it's not difficult, but for me, there's an opportunity to fix up a growing imbalance in our federation between revenue and responsibilities, and it's been brought into sharp focus by the recent federal budget. That's what it's done. It's brought it into sharper focus. But the issue was always going to be there. It's the debate we have to have. And on the issue of the Charities Commission, I remember the original establishment of that. I think Tim Costello had a fair bit to do with that. He was asked to work on that. A lot of other people who worked in their own time. I thought it was a very positive initiative, a very positive initiative.
Hi, John. Thanks for your presentation, as always. Two questions, if I may. But firstly, sorry you've lost your job. And it's a real pity that there seems to be a suggestion that it's heading towards one jurisdiction to oversee 9. Now, wonder if you'd care to comment on the terms of reference. We've heard often now that it's coming out very shortly. Mark Kenny made the comment immediately following the COAG meeting that it was agreed to but on hold. So I wonder if you'd care to put some definition to very shortly. The other question being, COAG has an amazing ability to be interpreted as governments talking to governments. And then we get to a situation where all the politicians throw their hands up and say, it's all too hard, the people won't vote for it. I wonder if that white paper might actually consider including some of the people that George Williams liked to include as we the people.
So I think that's a good question. I think there's two things. The terms of the white paper, that's a matter for the Prime Minister, and so I don't know where they are in the system, but I understand they're not far away. But he'll release them, I'm sure, at a time of his choosing. On the involvement of the public in this debate, I mentioned tonight I suggested a federation convention, but I think the more the discussion you can have about this, the better. And it's a discussion about the roles and responsibilities. And as I say, if you have that discussion, I think you end up with this inescapable conclusion that it is good public policy to better align the responsibilities with the revenue. And then when you come to this issue of revenue, you really come down to some pretty sharp some options which are in sharp focus. And as I said before, you can do income tax, But to me, that's a bit of a zero-sum game. We've already got a top marginal tax rate at 49, so you need to add another 10 or 20 cents on that, unless the Commonwealth government is prepared to cut all its own spending by an equivalent amount. So you're going to put marginal tax rates up, and to me, that doesn't work in the region around us. Or you're going to see savage cuts that will affect the most vulnerable in our community, and that's not something I'd support. You could see the states put up their own taxes, but as I said, it's stamp duties, it's a very narrow base. Or you can look at this issue, as I've said, of broadening out or increasing the rate of the GST and providing all of that revenue to the states. And as I said, it's not an easy discussion. If you ask the Australian people, if you ask politicians, put their hand up and say, do you support a tax increase? There's not many stand up at the front of the hall. But if you look at the other way of thinking of this, it's a bit like what John Daly at the Grattan Institute said in an interview recently. The other way of looking at this is look at all of the options for fixing the federation and for funding health and education. Increasing the GST, either the base or the rate, is the least worst or the least bad of all of those other options. And that's the conclusion that I've come to.
Thank you for your talk, John.
This is where Vince Fitzgerald corrects me on all my facts and figures.
I've done some work for you in this arena before. Anyway, given, if I'm right, increasing the GST rate and broadening the base, probably in the reverse order to those, is a very valuable way to increase the overall revenues available to governments at both levels in Australia, and I agree that ought to be on the agenda. But if I'm right, it won't go close to reducing the imbalance between expenditure control, command and responsibilities from the 70%, 30%, whatever it is, to what it ought to be. And therefore, why not have as well a sharing of the income tax base in exchange for giving back some Commonwealth grants? In other words, let them keep some of the money they're paying to the states now in grants and get a share of the income tax base, which, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean raising marginal rates. That's a separate issue. And I agree that that's not a desirable thing to do, given that it would hit our most skilled labour that's highly nationally mobile and so on. So why not take that as well and thereby allow the Commonwealth to keep some of its grants and stay out of micromanagement?
It's a very good question, and Vince Fitzgerald, of course, has done a lot of work in this area in the past. You could do that. My own view and the conclusion I reached is that, as I said, an increase in either the rate or base of the GST, there's a certain inevitability about that in Australia. And so it's a question of what you would do with the funds that flow from that. And in my view, is a unique opportunity to fix the federation and to fund a larger proportion of the health and education requirements in the future. So I don't suggest that it will fix all the vertical fiscal imbalance. That, as I said, for Victoria, it's for every dollar Victorians spend, 50 cents is coming from the Commonwealth. So it won't fix all of that. You'd need, you'd probably, haven't done the numbers for a while, but you probably need about a third of the income tax base to shift. Well, I think you need a fair hunk to shift across, and I don't see that as politically feasible. But the other point is this: if you look at the budgets of, and I didn't want this to be sort of Treasury speak tonight, but if you look at the budgets of federal and state governments, the fact is they haven't recovered post-GFC. When the GFC hit in Victoria, when I was Premier, it was a $2 billion reduction in revenues virtually overnight. And despite, the cutting and tweaking and tax adjustments that have occurred since under successive governments, that revenue in real terms hasn't recovered. And I don't see that it will in the next few years. So all of the governments are looking at a revenue base which is permanently lower post-GFC, at least for the foreseeable future. So I'm in the business of looking at an additional net new revenue stream. And I think this is the cleanest, it's the most efficient, it's the simplest, it's easiest to calculate the compensation that'd be paid. The other point I make about this is just this. You know, it is a difficult debate. You know, all of the political leaders, they'll all say, well, they're not budging on the GST. If you think to the last debate on the GST, part of the debate actually started to occur around governments, you know, and part of the 1999 agreement was actually some of the work done in the background between the Business Council of Australia, some advisors and consultants, and Robert Fitzgerald, then I think the chair of ACOS. And they came to the same conclusion that what was needed for Australia was reform of the tax system to grow the economy, and the key to it was making sure that the compensation provisions were fair and adequate for those who couldn't make ends meet. And so, you know, that's why, Vince, I've gone for that. It's cleanest, it's simplest, it's most efficient, you can do the compensation, and I think it works.
Good evening, Mr. Brumby. Simon Livesey here. I've just got a small financial problem that you might like to ponder. I've got a car that holds 52 litres. I went into a service station when it was just about empty and filled it up. It took a whisker under 62 litres. I complained to the girl at the desk. She said she'd forward it to the head office. I haven't heard anything in over 2 months. Somebody suggested I go to Weights and Measures, which I did. 3 weeks later, they tested the pump and found that it was within specifications, plus or minus 1% or whatever that means. I said, where do I go from there? I said, the car holds 52 litres. It took 62 according to the pump. They said you could try Consumer Affairs. I tried Consumer Affairs. They buzzed me back to Weights and Measures. What's your thoughts on this? Where do I go from here?
A very good question. Very good question. Did you try going... I'd exercise your choice as a consumer. I'd go to a different service station next time. That's certainly what I'd do. You could put a little placard out the front. You could stand there all day, warn customers, don't go there, they rip you off. You could do that. But on a more serious note, one of the things that I would hope that would come from further reform of the Federation, if there is any uncertainty about whether these things are federal or state, is that we can reduce some of that duplication or confusion about who's in charge. Okay, I better move on.
Gary Jungworth. John, I always understood our federal system to include the perennial poor cousin of federation being...
Like you're going to mention local government. Yep.
In your view, where does local government fit into a future discussion re role function funding at any federation convention?
Well, I think at any federation convention it's got a vital role. I didn't mention local government in my speech, Gary, because I knew you'd be here to ask the question. But Gary was a very good mayor in my electorate a long time ago. But I would think it's got a crucial part to play. And, you know, subsidiarity, you know, transferring the responsibilities to the level of government close to the people to do it. So local government's got a big role to play in the future. And again, I think some of these issues about budget certainty, budget stability, funding streams are all things which would come up there in a discussion, and they should come up. So I think it's an important thing, and that's why I proposed the convention.
Okay, we've got lots of questions. We do have a good amount of time, so we will try and get to you, but if you can give your question short, that would be helpful. Yeah.
I have to switch this. Oh, no, it's on. My name is Louise Watson. I'm from the University of Canberra. I've been involved in education policy since the 80s at the federal level, where I worked with John Dawkins and Vince Fitzgerald, I believe, as my boss, on the national curriculum.
Yep.
I must say, so I've followed federalism with interest since then. And of course, it's been a sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. It's a very messy procedure, but we have come an enormously long way. And if you look at education policy in particular, I never dreamt back in 1989 that my son would now have a textbook based on the Australian national curriculum. And it's a phenomenal achievement. So I guess I despair when federalism gets kicked back into this narrow financial box that the National Commission of Audit seems to have focused on, which you neatly referred to as aligning roles and responsibilities with revenue, which to me means the 3 Rs, which is well out of date. And I think it loses the population too. You know, governments talking to each other about roles and responsibilities and the buck sharing, buck passing. And so I like what you're saying about making it relate to policy. So if you want to argue for an increase in the GST, talk policy, don't just talk the 3 Rs.
Yeah. So let me...
What are the prospects, though, of those policies being national policies, not simply a return to the parochialism of the past?
So I tried to sort of address that in my remarks, and I did that by trying to say that we've got to be careful. It's good to have a degree of autonomy, and it's good to have a bit of competition between the states, but you need to be careful how far you take that. And I remember as a backbencher in the Hawke government, one of the reasons that Bob Hawke got the federal government more involved then in national education is, if my memory is correct, and I think it is, in Queensland at that time, in the early 80s, less than 4 out of 10 children were completing secondary school. And frankly, it's no wonder Queensland was struggling to compete, and frankly, it was an embarrassment to the rest of Australia. And so one of the reasons the national government got more involved was to try and lift the performance of the states. So that's why I said it's a fine balance. So I don't support what I'd call destructive competition, where it's a race to the bottom, lower services, lower standards and lower taxes, but some competition is good. And giving the states some more revenue to meet their growing responsibilities doesn't mean that you can't have national agreements about objectives and outcomes. And indeed, as I said, one of the things I've proposed, you know, I've called it a Federation Reform Council. But if you were going to provide more revenue to the states to do more things, it would be scandalous if you didn't have a body to oversee, monitor and check to make sure that taxpayers were getting value for money, that we were getting better results from schools, that we were treating more people in hospital emergency departments, that we were stopping more people from taking up smoking. So you need a plan, and you need timeframes and milestones, and you need monitoring. So call it whatever you like, but something's got to be independent and report to the public on the progress that's being made. Otherwise, you will get the worst examples, I think, of destructive competition.
Thanks, John. I enjoyed the talk very much. And I agree with you that at the heart of the problem is the fiscal imbalance, which is a problem not just because it starves the states of needed revenue, but because it leaves the Commonwealth with more revenue than it needs to meet its own responsibilities, leading to all sorts of excesses, of which arguably the school chaplains program is one. But can I say something about cooperation? Because of course I agree with you that in a federation like ours, in any federation these days, a degree of cooperation is important and necessary. On the other hand, it runs counter to some of the other values of federalism that you identified, including innovation and responsiveness. So somehow as a country, we need to work out, one, when cooperation is needed, and two, how to undertake cooperation in a way that is not simply unilateral decision-making on the part of the strongest branch of government, because when it gets out of control, as in many ways I think it has in recent years, it can itself be lowest common denominator decision-making, it can stifle innovation, and it is inherently opaque and intransparent. For all of those reasons, I'm a little bit sceptical about the Federation Reform Council. I think that one of our challenges, if we manage to reform the Federation, is to revive politics at the state level and rely on a little bit of democratic accountability also to monitor what's going on amongst the states. It's not to say there shouldn't be appropriate coordination, but I think to be endlessly talking about it as the solution has led us partly to where we are now.
Well, I think that's a fair observation, and I think it's also, to be honest, I think it's also just changes in the world around us, and it's particularly the media revolution. It's the it's the 24-hour news cycle, and so there's much more focus on all of these issues than there was in the past, and and again the media is more interested in sensational stories than sort of good news stories that all of the First Ministers sat down today and agreed to work well together. It's not going to run off the front page. So, but I think on the cooperation thing, I personally think that cooperation is really important. If you look at, and I mentioned in my speech, regulatory reform, the reality is that so much of regulatory reform involves the interaction of state legislation with Commonwealth legislation, and so you can get in areas, plastics and chemicals, for example, where there are 80 or 90 different bits of state and federal legislation. If you're a international company trying to trade across borders, fine line between plastics, chemicals, cosmetics, all sorts of things, it's a huge cost burden to you, and you will never fix it without the Commonwealth and the states working together. And that's what seamless national economy was all about, the 46 areas. It was about them working together. So again, you've got to be careful. You've got to have a bit of competition, but if you go right out there in the Wild West, and just sort of throw the confetti up in the air and let it rip and see how it works, you won't be able to have an efficient national economy that competes with the regions around us. And that's the point Ken Henry made about the rail and rail safety regulators. So you've got to have cooperation. And I think, to go to the education question and the health question, you're seeing in health part of the reforms that came out of the former federal government, the National Health Performance Authority now measures in every hospital around Australia how much it costs to do a hip operation, how much it costs to do an eye operation. So you can get rewarded for being more efficient. I think that sort of competition is good. That sort of competition encourages innovation, but it's very different to the sort of destructive competitiveness that can come if it's just helter-skelter. Final thing, just very quickly on COAG. The other thing I've said repeatedly about COAG, and particularly now, I've had best part of 4 years outside active politics. I'm on a lot of boards, a lot of organisation, a lot of businesses, a lot of not-for-profits. COAG, everywhere around the world, the last 10 or 15 years, the focus, not-for-profit and for-profit and superannuation, has been on improving governance and standards of governance. And really the only place it hasn't happened is in government itself. It's true. And the sort of, parade that used to occur with people going into COAG meetings, so there needs to be stronger standards of governance. COAG doesn't have a medium-term agenda. Every board I'm on will have at least one strategy day a year where we discuss the medium-term agenda. Most boards will have a strategic item every quarter that they discuss, but not COAG. It's what the PM of the day wants to put on the agenda at 6 o'clock the night before. So I think there can be enormous improvements just through some rules that govern the way COAG operates, in the same way as governments have been prepared to put rules on universities, on superannuation funds, on banks, private boards or not-for-profits. So I think a lot of improvements can come out of governance reform.
Hi John, my name's Peter Durand. John, continuing your thoughts on both regulation and also means of stopping the negative side of competition between the states, this race to the bottom, because we've seen several examples that recently, the relaxation of controls on protecting the environment, under-resourcing of regulators that are supposed to look after community standards of safety and health, etc. And also the increased casualisation of the workforce for which the state government's in control, particularly in teaching. If we are going to provide large increases in taxes so that the states can have total responsibility for health and education, which has got a lot going for it as a principle, would it also be reasonable to provide all the regulation of that at the Commonwealth level to ensure that across Australia we have minimum standards? in health, education, safety, and I might add to that in terms of avoiding corruption of government or the supply process to government through a national ICAC? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question, and you could look at those things. By the way, just on the numbers side of it, what I suggested tonight, as Vince pointed out, wouldn't provide the revenue streams to enable the states to have complete responsibility for health and education. It wouldn't be enough for that, but it would, in part, address vertical fiscal imbalance. It would, in part, sort of restore that balance, and it would enable the states to meet more of their needs in health and education. So it's an improvement. On the minimum standards question, it's a very interesting one. In fact, when we did the GST review, as you'd appreciate through the Grants Commission, they have to have a formula for allocating funds. We looked at whether you might change that formula and look at minimums instead of essentially averages, but we concluded against that. But it's an interesting issue, and again, I think these things need more discussion in the context of the white paper on Commonwealth-state relations.
Dennis O'Neill, thank you, John. That was a fantastic overview of the issues and the challenges. One aspect, though, that I didn't pick up was a reflection on the most wicked problem we've had in our federation, I think, which is the sheer difficulty of constitutional change because of the way it was set up in the first place. And if I've understood your preferences as expressed tonight, it's going to be about more negotiation, more talking through a COAG or similar process, rather than necessarily going back to the people for constitutional change, because simply that's a very tough call. So what is your view on the future of our federation in that context? Do you think that negotiation is going to get us where we need to go, or alternatively, do we need to look seriously at some changes around how we change our constitution to give the people a more direct say in the federation for the future?
So again, a very good question as well. I didn't go into that tonight because I thought probably 45 minutes was enough for you. But it's a very good question. I think one of the things that would come out at a Federation convention, people's discussion, would be some of those issues. So I have an open mind on that. But it's worth remembering, I think, as you know, just how hard it is to change the constitution. The majority of voters in a majority of states, and very few have been successful at all. So it is hard to do. But I think that's for a debate the other day, for later in the day.
Sharon Wilcox, I was one of the Health and Hospital Reform Commissioners, so keenly interested in the wind back of some of the health reforms. But my question relates to your views on the reward and facilitation payments and the national partnership agreements that obviously the COAG Reform Council had a major role in oversight. One of the myths or stories that's being told is that those payments and that structure didn't achieve the same success as national competition policy with major structural reform. Can you comment on whether you think those payments and those partnership agreements, which were unilaterally some of disbanded, were an effective model? And if not, what could be done to improve them?
Well, I'm personally a fan of reward payments and incentive payments, and if you look at, I haven't got the numbers with me tonight, but it's probably on the website, but if you look at the seamless national economy reforms and the report we did on that on the 46 areas, there is no doubt that progress was more rapid in those areas that attracted reward payments. So maybe coincidental, but I don't think it is. And my experience with national competition policy, and I was Treasurer at the time, so national competition policy was 95-2005, so I was Treasurer 2000-2005. Victoria was the best performing state of all, and because we believed in national competition policy and reform. But I'll tell you what, the money that was associated with it was also important. And the reason for that is that if you're doing difficult reforms, some of the reforms were things like water pricing. If you've got irrigation water and you've been a farmer around Swan Hill or Echuca, and you've basically had 30 years of getting water for nothing, pretty close to nothing, and then along comes a state government and puts it up because it's part of a national competition policy reform. The politics of that is difficult. It's a bit like putting up a GST. You know, so if you've got some funds that flow from the Commonwealth, they can enable you to reduce some of the pain or assist with the adjustment that might occur in those areas. So you might fund additional projects or job creating schemes or hospital buildings or education or support a new industry establishing that area as you're pushing up water prices to better reflect the real cost of providing it. So I'm a big believer in reward payments. You know, if I was writing all of this again, you know, and we had a sort of a national reform agenda Mark II, you'd identify again a whole set of areas of regulation reform that were important to the structural efficiency of our economy, and you'd attach some reward payments to them. That's certainly what I'd be doing.
Okay, last question, right at the back. John, my youthful recollections of the debate around the introduction of the GST was about the focus on the regressive nature of consumption taxes. In your oration tonight, you spoke about the need to protect vulnerable low-income members of our society. I'm not clear how, under an increased rate and base of GST, we would be able to do that. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on some of the mechanisms that you see would work in our federal system.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really fundamental point, like a really fundamental point. So, as I've said tonight, in my view, right or wrong, you know, the real debate today is not about whether the GST is going to increase. In my view, it will. Whether it's a year away, 2 years away, 5, 10, it's going to happen. So the real debate is it base or rate? How is the compensation worked out and to whom? And then the third question is, you know, who gets the money? Is it the states or is it businesses for company tax cuts or what? When you come to the compensation, in really sort of brief and simple ways, I think there's sort of three groups, if I can put it that way, that are affected. I think there's a lot of pensioners, particularly older Australians, who are affected. And, you know, for them it's a sudden increase in their weekly expenditure. You can calculate that pretty accurately, and I believe you can compensate for that very accurately by increasing the aged pension or changing means tests or various other things. But I think it is possible, with the right arithmetic and science and goodwill, to adequately compensate those people. The second group is low-income workers and families in the workforce but in lower paid jobs. You can address those issues, and this I think would be a major concern for groups like the ACTU, quite rightly. You can address that through things like the tax-free threshold or through a negative income tax or rebating cash back. There are various ways you can do that, and I think, by the way, they would build us a more efficient tax system. And indeed, some of the work we did in Victoria as part of the national reform agenda said that, you know, if you continue to lift that tax-free threshold up, the improvement and increase in participation in the workforce is very, very significant, particularly for women. So I think you can address that issue, and it's a matter of coming to a set of arrangements which adequately compensate people. And then the third group of low-income earners is young people. So when you look at the statistics, a lot of young people, particularly young people at university, are income poor. The British government, I met with British Treasury last year in the UK, they've done a lot of work on this area, and the interesting observation they make about young people is that a lot of those people who show up poor at a point in time are not poor through their working life. And to look at the impact of the GST, you really need to take a life cycle approach. So most of the students in the Commerce faculty here, they might be income poor today, but in 5 years' time they'll all be earning $75,000 a year. In 10 years' time they'll all be earning $100,000 a year. They can afford to pay a GST. So that group, I think, is less difficult to compensate and probably less vulnerable to other groups in the community. But broadly speaking, they are the three groups, and I think it is possible to do that. I don't put a number on that. I haven't got access to those figures, but I think you know, if you can get an agreement about a level of compensation so that people aren't fearful of these changes, then you've got, you know, a deal and you've got a way going forward to help the states to fund health and education, which, by the way, are vital services to those people on lower incomes in any case.
Well, as I said in the introduction, we held off holding the oration last year because we wanted to make sure that we had exactly the right person, somebody who had a very clear point of view that they were prepared to argue, somebody who understood the issues pretty much inside out, and somebody who had considerable experience of what all of this means politically as well as conceptually and theoretically. John has spoken, by my calculation, for as long as he's taken questions, which I think is quite remarkable given the range and diversity of the questions. And we know that the audience for the Hamer Oration is always incredibly well informed. So everything from local government weights and measures through to erudition around the finer points of law and the Constitution, John has dealt with incredibly ably, and I think demonstrated exactly why he was the person worth waiting for to deliver this year's Hamer Oration. So thanks again, John.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.